Okay, welcome back. And this is the last lecture I'm going to be doing for tonight. And this is also should be kind of wrapping up Units 1 and Unit 2. I think this is the very last lecture I need to do for Unit 2. I've covered parts of this when I've been doing some Zoom meetings with various students, but I wanted to kind of do the whole lecture all in one piece. And so what this lecture is this is the second art impulse that we're talking about. Every unit that we have for in the course, every unit has an art historical component. That's usually what leads us into the content for that unit. That art historical unit is like, let's say for the first unit, it was, prehistoric, Paleolithic, and Neolithic art. And then in this unit in unit 2, the the um the art historical unit is the art of the ancient civilizations, specifically of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And but we end getting all the way to like Greek ceramics, and then that leads to a whole lecture and a unit on ceramics. Ceramics is the art medium for unit 2. And then that also then leads to us talking about the design issues of shape and figure ground. There's always a design lecture for every unit. And but also the Greek ceramic vessels are also a really good lead into the Art Impulse lecture, which is about narrative, about telling stories. So the main point of Art Impulse lectures in general is to kind of think about the different reasons why people make art. And one of the main reasons why people make art is to tell stories. That we like to tell stories verbally, but we also like to tell them visually. And in a way, we have a lot of visual storytelling in our world. We have movies and TV shows. And these people didn't have that available, or most of these people that we're looking at the art of here didn't have anything like that available to them. But they did have theater, and they also had picture making as a way of telling stories. Okay. So, like always, I kind of break down some of the structure of the lecture on the very first page. Also have a grid of a number of images that kind of show you where we're going to go, some of the things we're going to cover. And yeah, let's start with very beginning about telling stories and about how oftentimes telling stories is very hard to separate that from political propaganda, from stories of power. So here we have one of the reliefs from the palace of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, and there is the king of kings himself, Ashurbanipal, and he is holding this lion back with one hand at the neck, right, choking it, and then stabbing it with his steely sword right in the heart. It's a pretty pretty powerful thing. I don't think he actually did that in person, but. So, yes, sometimes art is telling stories for political reasons. And there's a whole lecture on the relationship between art and power. We'll get into that some more. We'll talk about both of these images in much greater detail then. But also, art sometimes is telling, like, visual storytelling, like telling the stories of myth. And mythological storytelling is kind of interesting because in times, it's both kind of um, religious, but it's also like, so these stories, like let's say the stories that come from Homer, they have religious significance sometimes for the Greeks, but they also have kind of like um, an ethno significance, right? Meaning that like these are the stories that kind of tell us who we are as a people, the Greeks in this case, right? That it gives them kind of like like the Iliad and the Odyssey is a piece of literature that for the Greeks was very telling about defining what it means to be a Greek. And mythology also is interesting because it can be both kind of it can be both allegorical and symbolic, but it can also feel very kind of real world and can be set in a world that is both kind of set in the distant past and at the same time have very kind of like everyday real world aspects to it for the people who are telling those stories right then and there. And then also, a lot of stories that are told in art are religious stories. And we'll talk more about, especially about this painting, in a lecture entirely devoted to the relationship of art to religion and really kind of like explore the narrative in depth here in the Bellini. But just for now, we can kind of think about how religions have lots of stories built into them. Some are kind of like legendary, more like mythology, right? That they like the story of Judith and her maidservant and cutting off the head of Holofernes. It's a yeah, it's a story that has kind of like is I don't know, doesn't necessarily unlike let's say the story of St. Francis, where it's very much a faith journey in a way. It's a story where he is kind of like emblematic of like the right path towards the right sort of religious position. In some stories, they're much more like people who are kind of in the middle of things, doing some things good, some things bad, but there is a religious point to all of it. Okay. So some of the most successful, most interesting storytelling with visual art has taken place in book illustration. Because in book illustrations, where you're illustrating a story, you have to make sure that you're doing the job really well because it is the primary job. And there's a whole separate lecture and I think it's in it's either in unit 8 or unit 9 where I cover illustration. And in that lecture, I go into even more greater detail about the golden age of American and British illustration and painters like N.C. Wyeth and Elizabeth Shippen Green, both artists that I greatly admire. But for now, we'll just hint at that. And some of the best types of illustrations in terms of really figuring out how to tell stories with pictures happen in picture books, the books that are meant for pre-literate children, meant to be read to children ages, 1 through 4, 5, or 6. And of course, even when it's nice to read The Hungry Caterpillar, even to your college age students sometimes. Like all of my kids are getting that age. Lucy is the youngest. She's still in high school. And we're not at the end of the lecture, but one of the main parts of this lecture is this painting. And where I want to talk about the complexity of this particular narrative. So narrative in painting can sometimes be pretty obvious. Let's go back. Like it's telling a scene, a story. Men are in the woods. It's cold. They're struggling, but they're looking backwards. They're fearful that they're going to be attacked. It's quite clear. It's a moment in a story. But a painting like this seems like a moment frozen in time, and yet what exactly the story is a little bit of a mystery. It's a little bit of like, what's going on? And is there anything really happening? I mean, like there are little moments happening, like this girl is kicking this dog, right? But overall, the whole scene seems kind of like nothing major is happening. It's all just kind of in stasis. But is that all that's happening here in this painting? So what I want to point out is that like this painting is narrative in a sense because of the way it involves us into the painting. So let's think about what we're looking at here. Here we're looking at a big giant painting. I'm pretty sure Meninas is like about maybe 10, 12 feet tall, right? And in the painting, we're looking at Velázquez also painting on a big, large painting. And in this painting, and so we're looking at it, we're wondering, wait, are we here watching Velázquez paint this painting? And in a sort of way, I think the answer is yes. But in a sort of way, the answer is no, because what is he looking at, right? He's not seeing this scene. He can't see himself. He can't see these ladies. All their backs are turned to him, right? They're looking at us. So what are they looking at? What is he looking at? And what's right here where we are standing? Well, if we look carefully, we can see in the far back of the room, there's a mirror. And in the mirror, we can see the kind of like slightly fuzzy because they're in a mirror, but the likenesses of the king and queen of Spain, right? So Velázquez was the court painter of Spain. He was the painter for the king, and a position of great honor and pride. And he's in the moment in this painting. He's painting a portrait of the king and the queen. And we are either standing right here in the spot where the king and queen are, or we're maybe standing next to them. Maybe we are some key advisors or some maids and manservants for the king and queen. And so then this young lady here, who is the princess, she's not here to be the subject of a painting. She's here to amuse her parents while they're standing for their portrait being the subject of a painting. Because, being sitting for or standing for a portrait painting for a couple of hours and doing that multiple days, that can be kind of grueling, kind of boring. So you have to keep the parents amused. So she is here to be amusing her parents, and then these young ladies are here, the maids of honor, which is what the name of the painting is about, by the way. It's La Meninas, means maids of honor. The maids of honor are here to amuse the young lady, and they're working hard, right? They're doing their job well, and because she's not throwing a tantrum. And Velasquez is behind them. He's here to paint the king and queen. But in the background, we can see some other people, including this man who is just about leaving the room. He is a relative of Velasquez, I think a cousin, and he is also a key advisor to the king. So Velasquez is somewhat talking about how he is connected to power, his close association with the king and queen. In fact, also in this room, this is the room where the king's collection of artwork is contained. And there are all these beautiful, big, giant paintings by Titian and other great Renaissance and early Baroque painters. And one of the interesting things is that all of those paintings were bought because Velasquez advised the king to buy them. So it's both, in a way, showing off the king's collection, but it's also Velasquez somewhat bragging about his collection because he's the one that chose the paintings. And so there's this very complex dialogue of what's going on where we're standing sort of in the position of the king and queen. We're getting a sense of what it's like to be here. But at the same time, like I said, the name of the painting isn't standing in for the king and queen. It's La Meninas. And so that makes you wonder, what is it that he's trying to say with this painting? And so what makes this a narrative is that complexity of how you have to look at it. You have to think about all the different possible meanings that might be going on here, and whether this is the painting, or is this the actual painting that we're looking at, or is this a different painting, and that kind of thing. All right. So, I should have also been talking while we were looking at it this way. It's a lot easier to see with a black background. So I just have a few more points to make about narrative. One, I want to say that um, narrative is something that is really hard to not happen in a painting. There's like something about our human brain that wants to sees one thing and another thing and makes up a story, right? Like here we have a painting that's literally of a black square and a red square, and yet we can't help but see it being about some sort of activity between them. That black square looks like it's beating up on that poor little red square. What is going on there? Or similarly with these two shapes, right? So it's almost impossible to avoid our brains finding stories. And so the last point I want to make is about contemporary artists and how contemporary artists are also interested in storytelling, but there's kind of a slightly different approach. Contemporary artists are interested in narrative, but they're interested in much more of a as an expression of a process, right? And kind of like through documentation. Like a good example of this would be Stephen Behrens, who's a photographer, and he had a project where he took a photograph of every single person who came to his door, right? And So each photograph looks exactly, or not exactly the same, but like pretty much the same. Person's always standing in the corner and just takes a photograph. And then, so delivery man, friends, people come by, takes a photograph, uh, and does that for a year and then shows them all as a set. There is, it is about documentation. It is about um, creating, just kind of like creating a process of doing the same thing again and again. But at the same time, it does, when you look at all of them together, it tells a story. You start seeing the flow and things like, ooh, more deliveries happen around Christmas time and stuff like that. So here in Jillian Waring's piece right here, this is a performance piece that she did right when she was in graduate school, and where she and a friend got on the train in London and went all around Britain with just a big boombox radio. And every time they would get off at any train station, they're just kind of walk off the train to someplace, kind of open up. The friend would just put the radio down, press play, and Jillian would just start dancing like her life depended on it. Like just like full on, she's a maniac, right? Kind of dancing. And and then the friend would also take photographs and document and video people's reactions as this was going on. And so it's a very more interactive, right? Although maybe not that much more interactive than La Meninas. It's a very interactive and a very kind of process focused way of thinking about story and about creating story. Okay, and that's the end. So let's stop share and end it right there. All right, it was just me. Everyone have a good night.